This program is brought to you by Digital Laundry and the Fresh Bread Group. Coming up, a new eHarlem TV program, Harlem Speaks, a series of conversations examining issues impacting community residents. Our guest on eHarlem Speaks today is Angleo Falcon, who's coming back again to talk to us about the census and the research and analysis of the 2010 census. Angleo is the president of the National Institute of Latino Policy and a Political Science. Welcome back to eHarlem Speaks.
Nice to be here.
Let me ask you a quick question. Why is the census important?
Well, it's to me, the most important part of the census is that it generates every 10 years a major conversation in American society about the role of Latinos. Those numbers are put out there, and people are, usually surprised. Oh my God, the growth of the Latino population. I didn't realize there were so many Latinos here, and that generates a lot of conversation within the Latino community. A lot of positive conversation about the role, the kind of potential we have, political potential, economic, even cultural potential with these numbers. In the rest of American society, there's a real division. As people say, oh, that's interesting, the United States is becoming more multicultural. But then there are people who basically get panicked by the fact that there's so many, what's going on? How come there are so many of these people? Who are these people? They don't want to speak English. You get all this kind of xenophobic kind of discussion.
The fear of change.
Fear of change and fear of, basically fear of change in terms of where the nation is going. But it generates that discussion. And as you know, you've been at this for a long time in terms of the Latino community. There was a time when we had trouble getting the attention of the media, of the public in terms of Latino issues. Now what happens is with the census is that it's an amazing process, because I'm always amazed, no matter what the issue is, when the Census Bureau announces a new study or some data, it's covered all over the place. So the Latino issue becomes very, very important in terms of how the census projects us and in that conversation. Now, of course, it has other benefits. One is economic benefits. One, it's an important tool in the distribution of federal funding. And last time around, we're talking about $400 billion that is important. And then there are different sectors in our communities. In the corporate sector, for example, very important in terms of marketing. The census numbers become important in terms of market research, so that Univision and Telemundo got involved in promoting participation in the census. And a lot of people said, oh, how nice, how philanthropic. No, philanthropic my eye. It was basically commerce. I mean, they basically were doing it because it's in their self-interest in terms of making money. So these numbers get translated for a place like Univision and Telemundo in terms of making money. And I always have to point out to people, did you know that Telemundo and Univision are not owned by Latinos?
That's correct.
It's not. These are not Latino-owned businesses, but they use these numbers to make money. And so, it's got all these kinds of benefits.
Now, you were on a steering committee for the 2010 census.
Well, I was part of the advisory committee on the Hispanic population.
Okay. Now, let me ask you a question. Does the Hispanic population take the census serious only because we always complain that we feel like we've been undercounted?
Sure. Well, it's
because this is not an immigration issue. This is the law says you must count all people.
All people. Well, no, I think there was, an unprecedented level of mobilization for the 2010 census. Partially because the community, or the organizations in our community, the leadership understand the importance of the census. Also because there was a greater use of social media. And so, there was a whole different approach to dealing with the census. Then there were the issues of the immigration debate, and that is people who are advocates wanted to show that there are large numbers of Latinos, so that even people who were in the past reticent to get involved got involved and took a chance of getting involved because they knew it was important if you wanted immigration reform.
Well, I thought a lot of those advocates thought that it was important to count all the people, because they also felt that it had a ramification on federal funds coming into the community,
that's part
despite
of it.
The fact that
That's
they were illegals.
That's part of it, but also I think just the representation, the political representation, it kind of projected was important. There was a movement also by some ministers and others to boycott, by the Latino community, to boycott the census, this past census, because of the lack of responsiveness by the administration on the immigration issue. So, that was a kind of a challenge that we never had before, and that is people actually calling for a boycott. It turned out not to be effective because I think these other concerns kind of overrode that. But there was that attempt to kind of it was a very strange logic. I mean, I just, I debated some of these guys on this thing, and I didn't understand quite the logic of what they were doing. But again, it was interesting because it was a new kind of development within the community.
Now, let me ask you, it looks like New York has lost 2 congressional seats in this census. For people in East Harlem, what does that mean?
I don't think it means all that much. I think in terms of, we're talking about the loss of, probably politically, a loss of 1 seat in New York City and 1 in upstate New York. The one in New York City, one of the things that's interesting is that in New York, the districts that have been represented by Puerto Ricans are pretty much safe. There's not going to be much. I don't anticipate much of a change. We're finding the same thing in some of the current Dominican districts, except that the Dominican community wants to expand. So there's talk, for example, of developing a Latino congressional district that's predominantly Dominican,
encompassing Washington Heights and Inwood.
Washington Heights, Inwood, parts of the Bronx as well. The only complication there, of course, is that right now the guy who sits there in the middle of all that is Charlie Rangel, who, despite ethical problems he's had and all that, still is a powerful force. So that's going to be interesting to watch how that happens. But then there's also been a lot of discussion about dealing with that 3rd Latino district, congressional district, being in Queens. There's a Crowley, Congressman Crowley's district right now is something like 42% Latino. So there's been talk about increasing the percentage of Latinos there. Doesn't mean that it's going to become, Crowley's going to be displaced, but in the future, having a district that is predominantly Latino out there, and possibly, because right now, Charlie Rangel's district, the largest percentage of the population there is Latino.
It's interesting because I was just reading some stuff, and they were talking about how Latinos specifically have not gotten a fair shot in redistricting, and they made a point of the Dallas-Fort Worth area that should be a Latino district.
Right.
And they said the drawing of the lines had 7 districts coming through this particular community. What kind of effect does it have in New York at all?
Well, it's interesting because I think we made tremendous strides in New York. In terms of, if you look at the percentage of Latinos that are part of the electorate, we actually are well represented. We can't make the case that we're underrepresented, but in that case, we are well represented. We have a pretty strong, level of representation in city council and the state legislature, and even in the Congress. We have 2 congressional people. The population growth makes the case that we could have 3, 4 congressional districts that are predominantly Latino. The real action is going to be, to me, in Queens, because one of the problems we have is that Central and South Americans are tremendously underrepresented. So that's where it's going to be interesting, because you have in Queens a situation where you do have Latino neighborhoods that are split up between different districts. So the challenge is going to be to consolidate those. There's also out in Long Island a large Latino population, Salvadorans,
Very
Puerto
much so.
Ricans, that also
In Nassau and Suffolk, particularly in Suffolk.
that also have been kind of cut up as well. That's going to be a challenge. And then there are places in upstate New York, like in Rochester and Buffalo, Albany, that also, I don't think they have enough Latinos to make a majority district, and especially not at the congressional level or the senatorial level, but where we need to keep these communities intact so that they have maximum kind of impact. So those are the kind of challenges. But in New York City, for example, East Harlem is an area that's seen as a Puerto Rican area.
Which is not.
But it's historically, because East Harlem is really interesting, because for many years, it's been known as the cradle of the Puerto Rican community. Right now, the center of Puerto Rican power is really the South Bronx, not East Harlem, although,
That's because the migration goes from Red Hook to East Harlem to the South Bronx. I think, You know, most of the Puerto Rican families that came here from the 30s on kind of made that route, including mine.
But to this day, there's something special in the Puerto Rican community about East Harlem and the historical role of East Harlem. But politically, for example, you know, you have the city council, you have a Puerto Rican in the city council, the assembly has a Puerto Rican. And so, you know, I don't expect that that's going to change much, because part of the thing that helps us in New York is that the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Manhattan fall under the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act.
And the Justice Department has to check off before anything goes forward.
And there's also this issue that any changes can't result in retrogression. In other words, it can't result in us losing, you know, representation. But the interesting place politically is going to be Queens. That's where the battle is going to be, because it doesn't fall under Section 5. Yet there's a growing Latino population. They're very complex, as you know. You talk about Jackson Heights, you talk about Corona, Queens, you're talking about Colombians, Ecuadorians.
This is a 20 to 30 year development in Queens.
But I think, you know, in the last 20 years, for example, with the Puerto Rican community, made tremendous strides in terms of representation. But also, when we look at the current situation, we also see the limits of that so-called progress. That is, we have these representatives, but yet one of the things that gets me a standing ovation when I talk to Puerto Rican audiences or Latino audiences is when I tell them, look, we have a leadership crisis. Our elected officials, for the most part, are politically bankrupt, have all sorts of ethical problems, and people give me a standing ovation. And I usually un chorro de pillo, and people, tiene verdad, you know. And while there are good, you know, I think there are good elected officials in our community. For the most part, the story is the Pedro Espadas, the Hiram Montserrat, Efrain Gonzalez.
All the negative.
Yeah, that's what
all the felons.
Yeah, and it's quite a bit. I mean, it's not limited to Latinos, these issues, but it's a disproportionate number.
What's happened, I believe, Angelo, in a lot of ways, that the Latinos joined the club of rotten,
well, they joined the club.
Well, they politicians.
But they joined it at a very low. What's been interesting to me is, even though some of these guys have reached a level of some seniority, for example, with the state assembly or the Senate, but primarily the assembly, they still feel they're at the margins. You know, they have trouble getting an audience with whoever the governor is. They have trouble being influential in any serious way. The complaint we hear is, hey, how come the Democratic Party doesn't have Latinos running for citywide, statewide office? So why you have these guys?
Tell me why.
Well, I think because they've been able to take them for granted. They've been able to manipulate these guys. They brought them in. They were able to basically not pay attention to them. They haven't been an assertive group. I call them our political class has not been very assertive. Has been, you know, as they've gotten more seniority, some of them have gone from being outsider insurgents, challenging the system, to becoming a part of the system. And basically getting paid.
That's where they lost their power.
Well, I think they wound up getting, you know, playing the game of commercial politics, as opposed to using the language of community empowerment. And, you know, you wind up these guys getting involved with the whole thing of access and, you know, pay for play type of stuff at a very low level. And so that many of them actually, even the corrupt ones, I would argue, sell themselves out pretty cheap. I remember the story of Luis Olmedo years ago. Remember Luis Olmedo? In Brooklyn, in Williamsburg, who was at the time, this is, I guess, the 70s. At the time, he was early 80s. He was the senior Puerto Rican on the city council. And he was a funny guy because, you know, he would show up, you know, everybody else would go to city council meetings with their, you know, briefcases, and he'd show up with a shopping bag, you know. And what was funny about Luis is he got caught in a federal sting. They got him, it was a $12,000 bribe, you know, and he fell for it.
It's a famous story.
Yeah, and to me what was interesting more than anything else was, here's our senior guy in the city council, and his big defense during the trial was that he didn't know they were bribing him because he doesn't understand English. And I'm like reading it, I'm saying, but wait a minute, he's our senior guy in the city. He doesn't understand English, you know. No, I'm like, oh my God. So, you know, from an early period like that, you know, we've had this kind of problem. And as I mentioned, when we started the Institute, we noticed people were not holding these people accountable.
Please visit us on the web at eHarlemTV.com, where you could tell us what you think about our program, as well as access any of our stories. Let me talk about accountability. I take a look at the census, and I wonder if, when I think about, does it really deal with the educational disparities, the health disparities, the employment disparities,
that's a challenge.
the wealth disparities? Talk to me about that.
Well, that's a challenge. I mean, one of the challenges we have as a community is to have the kind of statistical policy, whether at the state, federal, or local level, that allows us to document these things. And we're always fighting for making sure that Latinos are included as a category. For example, at the Board of Education, what used to be the Board of Education, many years ago, they used to have information on Puerto Ricans and other Hispanics. Now they collapsed that into Hispanics. Mm-hmm. So we're not sure when they talk about the Hispanic dropout rate, is that the Puerto Ricans? Is it the newcomers? So we still have that battle. At the federal level, the census becomes really important, especially how that race and Hispanic, those questions are framed, because it's the data that allows us to document where we are in the society.
You see, but what I'm curious about, the data really ultimately shows the disparities that we have in wealth and education, and it seems like politically, it doesn't go anywhere.
Oh, well, that's a different issue. One issue is to try to document this stuff.
Well, I'm talking about reasons. Arming people with information.
Right, that's part of it. But one of the things that's been happening over the years is that we went from a period where there was a certain level of social consciousness in the 60s and all that, where people see these disparities and say, oh my God, as a society, we should try to do something about it. We should try to deal with these things. Over the years, there's been all kind of ideological battles around this, blaming the victim, all this kind of stuff, underclass research, toda cosa. And now we've reached the point where it's no longer seen as a societal problem. It's seen as individual faults that people have. People
the disparities?
Are poor. Yeah, people
the fact that we have a two-tier health system,
well,
two-tier education system.
People don't know how to use the system. They're very dependent on government. That's the main argument. In fact, I just saw something that came out of the Heritage Foundation that said, people really aren't poor. There are no poor people in this country. I mean, after all, when you look at the data.
Come on,
there's a whole paper on this. When you look at the data, most people, this is part of the argument, most people have refrigerators. They own refrigerators as part of the argument.
People in New York City, Angelo, are arguing that people under $75,000 a year, $80,000 a year are suffering, and pretty much so, after paying for rent or their mortgage, their education. I mean, if you don't go
But there's no reason. See, the argument today is they may be suffering, but it's their fault. They're either backing the wrong government policies, too much government, or they're not entrepreneurial enough, or hey, if you can't afford to live in New York, move. So what I'm telling you is now, when there was a time when you'd raise these issues about these disparities and we try to figure out how can society help, what kinds of policies can you develop to try to minimize, poverty, that kind of thing, to a discussion now where these, when you look at policymakers for the most part, and talk about these issues, they just look at you like, yeah, I don't, what are you talking about?
So how do you account for, in the Department of Health and Human Services, as a department that deals with disparities relative to minorities?
Well, we did a study a number of years ago where we looked at the representation of Latinos in the nonprofit health system, the hospitals, the Mount Sinai's, the Columbia Presbyterian, all that. And it was really interesting. We had a major reaction from the Hospital Association, the Greater New York Hospital Fund. We found that there were very few Latinos on the board of trustees of these nonprofit institutions and in management. And the reaction was amazing, when we did this. And one of the things we noticed was that there were all these studies that look at the disparities in, health services, things like that, the lack of doctors in certain areas. But we found that those studies have been done to the point where now people are numb. They don't react to these things anymore. When we started looking at the issue of governance, For example, what if you had Latinos, different kinds of people on the board of trustees of these specific institutions? And we did a profile of
Would
each one
anything
of them.
change?
Well, I think the reaction was such that you get the feeling, wait a minute, maybe we should be looking at issue of the politics of these institutions as opposed to these issues of the disparities by themselves, because the disparities, after a time, they become kind of abstract. In other words, you already know. If you follow the news, right? Every day there's some sort of study about this racial, ethnic disparities in health, education, housing.
Exactly.
Every single day, to the point where you would say there's something wrong here. It's something obviously that's structural. It's something that is part of the system. We need to use very different approaches than what we're using now. And what happens is that those kinds of arguments fall on deaf ears.
It's new, exciting, and important. eHarlem TV. Our guest, first-term Assemblyman Robert Rodriguez.
Anything that requires public land or public dollars with respect to housing should be affordable.
8 years ago, had an East Harlem initiative to promote tourism. Did it help out?
Initially, we had some success.
Todos van a brillar como las estrellas que vemos arriba.
eHarlem TV. Please visit us on the web at eHarlemTV.com, where you could tell us what you think about our program, as well as access any of our stories. If the argument of disparities is falling on deaf ears, what happens between, let's say, now and the next 5 years in terms of empowering people to make some change?
Well, it's a real challenge, because one of the things also that I need to acknowledge is that all the struggles from the 60s and all that stuff, people taking over buildings and raising these issues of these structural disparities, these structural problems, have resulted in changes. There is a minimal kind of safety net out there. If you don't have any money, you will get some sort of health care. Housing is a chronic problem, but still there are programs. So what you have, East Harlem's a good example. You walk through East Harlem and there are all these institutions in this place. East Harlem, for example, is not as fearful of massive gentrification compared to other neighborhoods. Why? Because of all the public housing. I mean, that's public housing. And there have been attempts to try to dismantle the public housing, but it hasn't been that easy.
Not yet.
So you have this public housing there that's a basic safety net. You have, these different health centers. You have different things. The argument now is that they don't reach enough people. Maybe the quality is not as good. But that's something that, again, you go back 30, 40 years, a lot of those things didn't really exist.
No, they were not.
So there's been some success. But still, we see that the level of poverty and those disparities is still there.
Let me talk about that disparity for a quick second. Some research is up in, I guess in one place was at Harvard, and I think one of the major research hospitals in New York talked about that these major institutions really don't care for the majority of minorities going into the health system, that there's a whole cluster of lower grade, non-board certified doctors who service those people. Have you heard anything about that?
Well, I mean, it's a kind of a natural thing that you have these large institutions. Look at NYU or Columbia. You have these very large institutions that have their own kind of dynamics. I mean, the kind of when we did our study of governance, we found the heads of these hospitals make so much money, $300,000, $500,000 and on. So those things have their own dynamic. The people who are the trustees are the richest people in the city. These are not health professionals. These are the Bloombergs and people like that. Those are the people who donate. If you go, it's got the name of every rich person, on each building. So what happens is you have these institutions that are out of touch in many ways, but then they're populated by many people, health professionals that do care.
Yeah, but if you go to Columbia Presbyterian, New York Presbyterian
right
now, the majority, the people are from Washington Heights that go into that place.
Right.
They're essentially Puerto Rican, Dominicans. I mean, they're minorities.
Right. But like anything else, unless we organize and hold these institutions accountable, nothing's going to change. And that's one of the things that we've lost. We've lost as a community the power of serious advocacy, and not just in the health area.
Why?
Education.
Right. Let's stay with that for a second. You know, we're 60s guys, let's face it. We grew up in a time when there was rebellion, there was advocacy, there was even some coalition building with some people.
Sure.
We wanted to advocate for change. It seems like the change makers are not in the same quantity today.
Right. No. Well, as I said, as a result of a lot of that work, there have been some victories, and I think that's part of the answer. That there is a basic social safety net now. We're fighting for, around budget cuts, but it's not the same thing as 30, 40 years ago. So that's part of it. So success sometimes breeds these kinds of situations. On the other hand, I think our advocacy organizations have become much more corporate oriented, have become much more controlled by government. For example, a lot of our community-based organizations.
Some people will suggest, Angelo, that they don't take the risks.
Well,
that they need
because now, for example, a lot of them depend on government grants. And so once you receive government monies, so that's part of the problem. The other part is that there is a small but successful Latino professional class that we didn't have before. I mean, when I mentioned the elected officials, we didn't have that many elected officials before. We didn't have Latinos down in Wall Street. Not that we have a lot, but there are some. In government, there are people that are, commissioners, that kind of thing. So what happens is it's a different world than 30, 40 years ago, when we could basically say, look, we're totally on the outside. Now we're largely on the outside. We still feel marginalized, no matter what the census says in terms of numbers. And how do we begin to, adjust to this new reality?
Last question. How do you see the future in that context?
Well, it's an uphill battle, and you never know the way the country's going, what's going to trigger this next, I hope, set of activism in the Latino community. Clearly, immigration issues out there, but there are other issues affecting Latinos beyond immigration. One of the things that historically it's hard to tell when something hits that mobilizes a community and raises issues. Look at the Arab uprising. So let's wait and see what history brings us.
Angelo, always a pleasure talking to you. Angleo Falcon, President, National Institute of Latino Policy. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
On eHarlem Speaks. This program is brought to you by Digital Laundry and the Fresh Bread Group.